So I have been retired now. I'm in my third year. And the thing that surprises me the most is when I see people that I've worked with over the years in the foundation, they always tell me, the first thing they say is, "You look so good," which makes me worry about what did I look like before? It's like, how bad was that? Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction. And I was a director of the foundation for 17 years. How that came to be is a little bit of a story. So in 2005, Jim and I decided that we wanted to have a horse property. And we both had a strong affection for horses and riding. And it wasn't going to happen in San Francisco. We weren't going to find a property big enough. And if we did, it would be really expensive. So we started looking. And my grandparents had lived in Placerville, so we came up here. And it was supposed to be for a short vacation. And that was my concept of why we were here. And as we came on Shingle Springs, Jim said, "Take this exit." And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because we're going to go to an open house." So in November of 2005, we moved from San Francisco to Shingle Springs on 6 acres. Had no concept of what we were in for. Trees fell, plumbing didn't work, and we lived in a house that all it needed was an axle and you could just drive it away. Over 20 years now, it's a little piece of heaven and paradise. At the time in 2005, I was still working in the Bay Area, and I was commuting from Shingle Springs down to Concord and then back home every day. And I did that for 1.5 years. At that time, I was working for a nonprofit, and it was my first experience with nonprofits because I come from a corporate background. And I took that job at the nonprofit because my father had had a stroke. My mom, who is incredibly stubborn, wanted to make sure my dad stayed at home and didn't go to a care facility. So in order for her to do that, she was going to need my help and my sister's help because my 2 brothers are totally useless. So we told my mom we would help. And I couldn't continue my job at John Hancock with the amount of time that my mom needed me. So I took a job at a nonprofit in Concord that did alcohol and drug rehabilitation. Saw about 12,000 people a year. And I was the operations manager, so I wasn't in the clinical side. I was working on the back end on the operations. Well, after 1.5 years of commuting back and forth, one day I left Concord and suddenly I was in Fairfield. Couldn't remember how I got there. Went home and said, "This is crazy, I've got to do something. I have to find something closer to home." So I started my search for another position, interviewed with a couple of companies, one which was a private foundation, which I just remembered the other day. I didn't get that job, but I was offered a job with the California Chamber of Commerce as an analyst. The idea of commuting down to Natomas every single day didn't really thrill me. And I went to the interview, actually it was a number of interviews, and Bill gave me a little signal of move over. And they ended up offering me the job, but it was going to be working in a cubicle again. And I just didn't want to do that. So I came home and Jim said, "What'd they say?" And I said, "Well, they offered me the job." And he goes, "You don't seem to be real excited." And I said, "I'm not." So I looked online that night and there was a posting for the Dorado Community Foundation for the grants coordinator. And I applied, sent my resume to Steve Healy. Steve interviewed me Thursday, the next day, that evening, and hired me on Friday. And I started on Monday. Not so fast. First day of work, Jim takes my car keys with him to his job. He's an RN with Kaiser. I have no car to get to work on my first day. So I called my neighbor, they drive down, drive me into Placerville. I had 1 week with Kathy Jensen, who I was replacing. She was leaving, to learn everything about a foundation, something I knew nothing about. I learned about how the foundation operates, how the foundation was attempting to grow itself, and a system called FIMS, Foundation Information Management System, which was an absolute beast. And I've worked on a lot of operating systems, and this had to be the absolute worst I had ever seen. It had been modified so many times that it was hard to understand how the relationship within the system worked. So it was a little bit of a challenge. What I brought to the foundation in that position was rather unusual. Most nonprofits even today, the directors come up from the clinical rank. So they're not necessarily people that have experienced a corporate background in business. So most of them are clinical or clinicians. So Steve Healy, who was the director at the time that I started, came out of New Morning as a clinician. Very, very typical. We're seeing more and more of that change today as more nonprofits are being run by people with a business background. So that's really changed the very nature of how nonprofits operate. My mindset in joining the foundation has always been still that corporate mindset of ROI, return on investment. So how do you translate that into a community foundation where it's not necessarily an investment that's monetary, but investment in community? So that was part of what I was thinking when I became the director, is how do I move this foundation forward to be able to achieve the goals that are possible? And in the very early stages, I joined the California League of Community Foundations. There's 34 community foundations in the state of California that belong to the league. These are foundations that are some of the largest in the world. There's the Silicon Valley Community Foundation that has, the last time I checked, was $12 billion in assets. The Marin Foundation, which is over $1 billion in assets. Santa Barbara is another really large one. So you're sitting in a room with directors that have huge knowledge on building philanthropy in their community. And you're listening to how they are going about it strategically, thinking of building community. And they were all very strategically minded. So they would focus on particular aspects. Silicon Valley Community Foundation was very focused on payday lenders because they saw that as being very predatory. The Orange County Community Foundation was very focused on immigration. Sacramento Community Foundation was focused on literacy. And when I say focus, what is occurring there is those organizations are not only directing their internal grant making onto those topics, but also they're asking their donors to go in the same direction. So they're asking donors that have donor advised funds to move their money towards, let's say, literacy in Sacramento. Well, I was paying attention to that and thinking maybe this is what we need. The foundation had accomplished a couple of those previously. One was Adelante, which was focused on the Hispanic community in El Dorado County. And then the next one was the older adult convening, which I was brand new to the foundation when that occurred. And it was examining what are the needs in the community through that process. As this is all occurring, I go to an event up in South Lake Tahoe. And I had befriended an individual through my experience up in Tahoe, and her name is Jamie Orr, and she has a doctorate in physics. And Jamie said, before you go to the Seroptimus event, let's meet for a drink. And not surprisingly, at a bar. That bar experience changed my life and changed the trajectory of the Dorado Community Foundation. Jamie, her study in physics was on emergent behavior. Now, we think of emergent behavior in the natural setting. So if you're driving across the yellow bypass and you see those birds flocking and they start to move in a pattern, that's emergent behavior. So there's a couple of rules in emergent behavior in nature is you don't crowd your neighbor, you fly in the same direction that your neighbor is moving. And the reason why emergent behavior appears in nature is to ward off predators. So they become larger. So the predator thinks, well, I'm not going after that. That's way bigger than I am. But then Jamie explained to me, as we drank our margaritas, about how emergent behavior shows up in people. And that was not something I was familiar with. So I started after that doing some research into emergent behavior and how we react as individuals. And what I found out was we do move in certain directions. Now, when I worked for John Hancock, I was responsible for acquiring ranch lands in California, Oregon, Washington, and Australia, and purchasing commodities. So John Hancock wanted to diversify and go into agriculture. So when you drive down Highway 5 and you see all those pistachio and almond orchards, those are usually owned by either Hancock or Prudential insurance companies. And it's how they diversify their investment portfolio. And I was responsible for purchasing those ranches. So the ROI played a real significant part of that, because for a pistachio tree, it has a 15-year lifespan. I can't believe I still remember that. And after 15 years, the full production has occurred. You push the tree over. That's why you see them pushed over, because it's ended its production lifespan. And then they'll plant a new tree. So that was something that I became aware of, is that community is not a tree. It's not a static entity. Community is constantly changing. It's constantly emerging. And how that community emerges really led the way for how I found my way in being the director of the foundation and growing the assets of the foundation. So instead of moving towards strategic philanthropy, I moved into this new field called emergent philanthropy, where your philanthropy doesn't lead community, your philanthropy follows community. So Stanford University, and I told Charlie I would mention Stanford during this talk. Stanford University, and they have a school that studies communities and social behavior, has done a study, intensive study, on the difference between emergent and strategic philanthropy. And they found that strategic philanthropy works for as long as the funding continues to come. When the funding stops, it tends to, like in literacy, you tend to go back to that community baseline after a number of years. Because the only thing that was propelling it forward was the philanthropy money, not community. Community wasn't moving with the strategic plan of the foundation. Hello. Hi, Carol. Are you like the surprise? Are you going to be the guest speaker now? Yeah. So. Yeah. So there was another subset reason to move towards this more emergent philanthropy. Is for a long, long time within the community foundation realm, and there's like 958 community foundations across the United States, is that your expenses are based upon the income that you receive from your funds. So you're charging the funds a certain percentage, low, and you're hoping that's enough to feed your operations. So you're always being concerned, do we have enough funding to pay for what we're doing? Well, a company called the FSG did a study for the Council of Foundations and found that as you grow in your assets, your expenses went right along with it. That would never change. So there had to be a different strategy around that as well. How are we going to become self-sufficient as a community foundation? So not only are we looking at emergent philanthropy, but we're also trying to figure out how do we pay our way. Now, the foundation was really fortunate that it had a supporting fund. But at the rate it was being invaded, it was going to be gone in about 6 years. So we had a very short timeline to figure this out, about how do we pay our way. And part of that was engaging in the community and building unrestricted funds versus restricted funds. Now here's your education part. This is the education I gave my mom and dad. And I'll give you the example of what happened at their house. So the phone rings, my mom answers it, and I'm in the living room with my dad. And I hear my mom go, "Oh, that's nice, that sounds good. Well, let me talk to my husband, hold on." She comes out and she said, "Bud, there's a man on the phone from Contra Costa Sheriff's Office and says that they're soliciting donations and wants to know if we will donate." Now, my parents were big philanthropists. They came from a very poor background. My dad was a coal miner. My mom married my dad when she was 16. She didn't graduate from high school. But they moved from Southern Illinois to California when I was 2 years old and made a great life. And so they always felt this need to give back. And she asked my dad, "How much do we want to donate?" Before he answered, I said, "Ask the gentleman on the phone how much goes to this campaign." And she goes back and she says, "How much goes to the campaign?" And she goes, 80%? You mean 20% is actually going to the sheriff? That's it? And then she hung up the phone. So whenever you're giving, remember whether your gift is restricted or unrestricted. If you restrict a gift, if you give to the Red Cross and you just signed a check for $100, that's unrestricted. They can use that to buy lunches. If you write on that check in the memo line, "This is for blankets," it has to be spent for blankets. So that becomes a restricted gift. So I got off on that tangent, now I forgot where I'm at. So I knew the foundation needed a plan to grow. And that plan was going to have different aspects to it. What I knew that needed to occur is that the foundation needed to be present everywhere. Joe Black was not sitting at home in his recliner with his wife next to him thinking, "Boy, I need to call Bill Roby. I'm thinking of dying." That's not going to happen. Where those people are at events, at fundraisers. That's where donors are. And so I started showing up at every fundraiser and letting people know the foundation was showing up. Not to poach their donors, because that was not my goal. It was to be present, to show up. Because that, I think, is hugely important. We're a supporter of the nonprofit community. We're there because of the nonprofit community. So for me, it was important to show up. And most of the conversations I had that were really important happened at those fundraisers. People, after 2 years, would start to seek me out and have side conversations and say, "Let's get together later and talk about this." So it was being accessible. Also delivering a message is, it's not what you can do for the foundation, it's what the foundation can do for you. That was important. Be willing to help. We may not have all the answers, but maybe I know somebody you can talk to that may be able to help you. Cut costs by developing in-house capacity. That was another thing that we wanted to be able to achieve, is constantly look at our overhead cost. And Charlie really helped a lot with that. So I never thought I was going to get into physics, being the director of a community foundation. So I'm going to read you the dictionary description of emergent behavior. In emergent behavior, the complex outcomes are not directly integrated into the system, but they emerge from the system. So that made sense to me. It's that what we do from an emergent, by supporting emergent needs in the community, the outcome is going to be what I'm looking for, and that is a foundation that grows. So when I started at the foundation back in 2007, the foundation had $8 million in assets, and it had granted in 2007 $350,000. So you fast forward to today to say, did Emergent Philanthropy work? The foundation today has $40 million in assets and grants over $3 million a year. Now, did that happen overnight? No. No. It took a long time to get there, and it was a slow march, but it was well worth it. The community is benefiting so much from the effort that we put into it. So one of the examples, there's a couple examples of emergent behavior and how it played into the foundation's growth. So there was a conversation that I had at a Starbucks on Hazel Avenue, and it was in the summer. And an individual happened to be in town, and we met, and we were talking. The individual actually talked about something called the Women's Fund. And I was curious about how it operationally would work and what it would bring in value to the community. So as they were talking, I'm writing on a napkin and starting to map it out of how this system would work and what oversight it would need and how granting would be accomplished. And at the end, I said, okay, this sounds doable, but we're going to need to do some work. And then years later, last night, they celebrated again their grant celebration. And it started, Katie, in 2008. The Women's Fund started in 2008. So that individual I met at the Starbucks was Katie, and who talked me into doing a women's fund. And that is a perfect example of emergent behavior, is individuals coming together to give a small amount of money, but together they hold great wealth and can make a huge impact. Another example is the Caldor Fire. And that is an experience I will never forget. It consumed us as a foundation in a really good way. So I often say that Dorado Community Foundation was the county's best kept secret before Caldor Fire. And then after Caldor Fire, a lot of more people knew who we were. So the fire started, I believe it was on Sunday. On Monday, the fire made its run towards Grizzly Flat. And on Tuesday night, it burned through Grizzly Flat. The foundation immediately set up a fund to help individuals that were being evacuated and had probably at that point lost their homes. And we really didn't know what to expect. So donations started coming in to the foundation to support individuals. And locally, that was the first wave, was local funding. People were making donations. And then it went on to KCRA. And so it spread. We saw more donations coming in from the Sacramento region. And as the fire moved and progressed, it went to Bay Area television stations and news stations. And we saw the Bay Area starting to move in. And then it crested the summit and threatened South Lake Tahoe. And it went national. And as a foundation, we blew up. The funding was coming in so fast, it was hard to keep track of it. But at the same time, we have more and more people in need. We had a third of the population of El Dorado County under a mandatory evacuation. And when you think that a lot of these communities, like Poly Pines and out in South County, these are not communities that are populated by people that can afford a $500 emergency, much less be out of their homes for 2 weeks. So we started an initiative of providing funding, emergency funding for individuals that had been evacuated. We were really lucky that we had a great partner in the California Fire Foundation. So we were able to give 500, and then the California Fire Foundation gave out 200. So we were giving out $700 to families that were in need. And this made a huge difference. I can remember the lines of people lining up at the foundation that would come out of the courtyard and go down past bunkers. And people that were there because there was a need. And they found out about the foundation. And our response was emergent. We immediately responded to something. Now, could we have done that if we were a strategic foundation where our money is going to something very specific? Could we move that fast to address a need? I don't know. But I know that we did. And from that, we accomplished a lot. We helped a huge amount of people. Over 55,000 people received aid from us. And people now knew who we were. And that's part of Emergent Philanthropy, is getting your name out there. So it's flexibility. So as community shifts their focus on what the need is, the foundation, when you're emergent, you're able to shift with it. And I'm going to go back to that Stanford study. What they found is that, along with, as I said, along with strategic philanthropy, when the money is coming in to resolve a problem, that problem progresses and gets better. So literacy, it's working. The moment they withdraw the funding, the literacy rate starts to go back to the baseline because the funding's disappeared. With emergent philanthropy, you're moving with community. So community's focused on a particular issue. When you move with them and provide the funding that they need, they start moving even further. They progress, they accomplish more, they achieve more. When the foundation pulls back on their funding, community doesn't leave. They're still vested in it. They had just become much better at it. An example was around housing and homelessness in El Dorado County. So what occurred was we had a lot of organizations that were not working together, that were trying to resolve both housing and homelessness. So in total, I think there were 7 different organizations, all nonprofits, that were all working not cohesively together, but separately on different aspects. And what we did as a foundation is we brought them all together and said, is there a possibility that if we provide some funding, that you can all join and become one entity? And we'll help you. we'll work with you and a new board in developing some strategies and developing how to conduct a meeting, how to make minutes, how to form committees, what the committee's responsibilities are. And they said yes. And out of that formed Housing El Dorado. So the organizations that were around the homeless and the housing all formed under one umbrella. We provided funding for their startup to get moving forward. Housing El Dorado is still here today. Housing El Dorado looks like they're going to become a main player with the county in addressing homelessness in El Dorado County and affordable housing. So that's how Emergent Philanthropy works, is moving forward, helping the community in something they've already identified as a need, providing funding to move them even further forward, but when we move back, they still exist, and they're still accomplishing great things. So we're very excited to see Housing El Dorado receive grants and working with the county now productively. Before, I would go to the supervisor's chamber and watch individuals get up and yell at the supervisors around issues of homelessness and housing. And I thought, that's not going to accomplish anything. They're just going to tune you out. So one of the things we talked to them about the first couple of meetings is, you need to take it down a little bit and be cooperative and be a partner. Because once they see you as a partner, then they're going to start engaging with you. But if you're always yelling at them, they're not going to want to listen. And by the way, I would never run for public office. I think that living in that fishbowl, you got to be nuts. So the community foundations that are going to prosper are going to be those that diversify in how they attract funding. So we have to move away from this model of dependence on fees. So that's not going to work. That FSG study showed us it's not going to work. As your assets go up, your expenses go up. So community foundations are now starting to shift and look at themselves as contractors. What are we good at? We're good at managing grant process. So we're in the middle of COVID, and the county receives federal funding to support businesses throughout El Dorado County, $5 million. And where did they come? They came to the El Dorado Community Foundation to ask us to run the grant process. So businesses could apply, and we could provide the funding back to them by way of the county. And the foundation was able to take a contracting piece of that and keep it for the work we did. That's unrestricted funding that supported our operations. So we're going to see community foundations start to move into that world of doing contract work, because that is where you can make money to support your operations. The community foundations typically do not do fundraisers. I'm really thankful we never did one. A lot of times they cost almost as much as what you receive. So you have to be very careful when you're doing them. But the foundation is been incrementally able to meet its obligations when it comes to staffing and pay for the overhead of the foundation. Part of that is a couple of different things happened. One was we were the beneficiary of a very wonderful gift. The foundation was on Cedar Ravine in a little cottage. And when I became director, I really wanted to get onto Main Street. And a donor at the foundation who sits on the board, was a board member, owned a commercial building on Main Street. And I found out that the upper suite was empty. So I went over to see her and said, Joyce, can we have this suite for free? And that way we'll be on Main Street. And we'll have a big sign out front that says Dorado Community Foundation. Joyce said, well, let me think about it. That's okay. And that is my personality. I'm not going to push. I don't do that. And I thought she'll get back to me if she decides maybe this is a good idea, it'll be a good fit. Well, I had lunch with her 2 weeks later, and Joyce complained the entire lunch about a tenant and how it was just contentious relationship and arguing, and that's not what she bought the building for, and she thought she would enjoy it. It was a real pain in her bottom, and it was keeping her up at night. And I said, Joyce, I can solve that for you. She said, how? Give me the building. She said, what? I said, give the foundation the building. I need to talk to Ted, her husband. I said, okay. About 3 days later, Joyce called and said, are you ready to go sign? I said, yep, where do you need me? And what a huge gift that has been for the foundation is to own that building with income that comes in, passive income that comes into the foundation to support their operations. So the foundation still occupies the top level, but has tenants that are great, that you need to go visit and buy things from, so they can continue to pay their lease payments. So that was one of the strategy of helping the foundation maintain its ability to pay its expenses. So you're always looking at where are those opportunities and responding to the ones that appear out of nowhere. And that drove I can tell you, without a doubt, that drove the staff of the foundation crazy. So as director, I'm looking at where community is moving. Now the staff is working on something. And all of a sudden I walk in and say, okay, we're changing. Because community is now moving over here and we need to go do this. And so it was always a little bit hectic in the office about what we were focusing on, because we were moving towards whatever was happening in the community. So we had to be nimble. And fortunately, it worked because the community foundation kept growing. But there were some people that were used to more of a corporate setting where you have a strategic plan and you're going to follow that plan. Well, we didn't. I didn't see how a strategic plan would work for this foundation, because it's going to set us in a particular direction. We're going to want to achieve these certain objectives while all this other stuff is occurring, and we're going to miss opportunities. So it's paying attention to what is occurring and really maximizing on those opportunities. And that worked, or else we wouldn't be at 40 million. So the opposite story is Placer Community Foundation. They focused for years on the arts because the Irvine Foundation gave them a grant to do that and helped underwrite their operating costs. Now, when I started the foundation, Placer Community Foundation was way ahead in assets. Now they're way behind because they're still doing that strategic philanthropy. So I think we're going to see more and more community foundations and foundations as a whole move towards that emergent philanthropy and what's occurring within the community. Now, there was an occasion a week ago, I was asked a question, and I gave a very glib answer to it. It was a very kind of consultant answer, is what I was told. And I had to think about the question. And so I have a story to tell you. And it's the story of the dogs. So we have 4. 3 are Australian Shepherds, Lily, Shelby, and Dolly. And then we have a Fox Terrier. His name is Archie, and he drives me crazy. The girls, well behaved, do everything you ask. Archie doesn't care. He doesn't. He's a terrier who's just like, nope, I don't care. Whatever you ask me, I don't care. Well, a couple of years ago, we're looking for a house sitter. So to board 4 dogs is going to cost a lot of money. So we're looking for a house sitter that's going to be in the house, the dogs can stay in their environment, and everything will be fine. So we're interviewing people. A friend of ours referred us to an individual from El Dorado Hills, and she came over to meet the dogs and us, and to see where she would be staying. And we were going to be gone for about a week and a half, maybe it was 2 weeks. So she came in. The girls are as polite as can be, Archie not. He is jumping all over her. And that's how he is. He gets really rambunctious for about 15 minutes, and then he doesn't care about you. But he's jumping on her, and she turns and looks at him and says, his behavior, that behavior will change by the time you get back. And she said it in a very stern voice. Now, we travel a lot, so this is important that we find the right person. We're on 6 acres. And these are dogs that are like our family. So Jim and I are looking at each other going, well, let's keep going with this interview and see how it works out. So we have a cottage on our property, a small cottage that was built for Jim's mom to stay. And we took her over there because that's where she was going to stay while we were gone. So Jim walks in, I walk in, she walks in, Archie walks in and pees on her leg. Seriously. It's like he knew. He just lifted his leg and peed on her. And we're like horrified. 2 hours later, she calls and after she left and says, I don't think this is going to be a good fit. We were not surprised. So in the story I just told you, what does that say about me? I'm an animal lover. I travel. We live on acreage in Shingle Springs. We have a cottage. So stories and storytelling is so incredibly important for a director to hear, because those stories tell me about who you are, about the things you're passionate about. They're giving me an insight into the things that bring you joy and purpose. So Charlie, that's how I got to yes. Not the glib answer I gave you last Saturday. That is how I got to yes, was by listening to their stories. So every donor, every potential individual that walked into the foundation, my first thing I said to them was, tell me about you. Where were you from? Where did you grow up? What was life like? How did you meet your spouse? Because those stories were giving me information about the things they cared about, that I knew that I could then talk to them about, to be enthusiastic with them about. And one thing in philanthropy that I learned during 17 years is, as a director, you can't fake it. You can't pretend you care. You can't pretend you care about the community or you care about the donors. You actually have to feel it, because they're going to feel it. They know. They know whether you're sincere or not. I mean, when we have people that come to the door or people that solicit you over the phone, you know if they're sincere or if they're not. And that makes a big difference. Now today I spent a lot of time writing all these notes on these note cards, and I hardly read any of them. but it gave me a sense of comfort in being able to come and talk about what it was like for 17 years being the director of the Dorado Community Foundation. And it was not what I was expecting, that's for sure. It was a tremendous ride. Yeah, Karen.
Two questions that may not interest others, but they interest me. What year were you drinking that margarita in Tahoe?
Good question.
How early in your 17 years? Do you remember?
So the question is, how early did I start drinking? So well, actually, so I talked about my grandparents lived here in Placerville. My grandfather worked for Bechtel, and at that time he was up at the Whiskeytown Dam building it. He was a large crane operator. So my grandmother spent pretty much all summer by herself. So I'm the middle kid who was always in trouble. So my older brother is 3 years older than I. My younger siblings, Kevin and Jennifer, are a year apart, and they're 3 years younger than I am. So I'm the middle kid. So of course I'm the one on the bus, went to Greyhound on Upper Broadway, and my grandmother picked me up. And my grandmother did two things, fish and drink beer. So I started drinking beer pretty early, Karen. So I was probably about 10, and she would always, my grandmother would go, yep, don't tell your mom. I'll get in trouble. So I've been to every lake in the Sierra fishing with my grandmother. But I think that was 2009. It was relatively early. Because I was describing to Jamie the very concept of a woman's fund, of this collective giving. And she said, that's emergent behavior. And that triggered me. It was like, wait a minute, what do you mean about emergent behavior? And she gave an example. I don't remember what college it was done at, but it was an experiment where they lined up 200 students in a hallway. And from the very front, they went back 60 and then told those 2 rows of students that when you get to a certain point, make a right-hand turn. So the front of the line is told, go to the end of the hall. So the line moves, comes to that 2 rows, 60 back to make a right-hand turn, and everybody follow that right-hand turn after them. And that's emergent behavior, is that we tend to follow what's in front of us. So I think it was about, 2008.
The reason I asked that question, I don't think that Charlie heard your story, your philosophy of emergent behavior, nor did I. And we had our 9 years on the board. Was it always just suddenly rising up in your psyche?
Yes. The more I saw it, the more engaged I became in it. There was a point where I did have the conversation with the board about emergent behavior, but it was after you and Charlie had left. Because that was when it was becoming apparent that this is really the way that we were moving. And that was after I had read the studies at Stanford on the comparison between strategic and emergent. So
My second question is, we are a changing society.
yes.
So what comes after your emerging? Is there another philosophy out there? Is there another idea other than?
So the question is, what's the future of philanthropy? What I think that.
No, not really. I mean, do you see that emergent behavior is going to change?
No, we still see it. We see it in our politics, especially right now. I think it's part of our nature, as it is the birds that flock over yellow bypass. It's something that's always with us. Will philanthropy change? Yes. There will be an algorithm that predicts giving patterns. Will AI replace philanthropy? No. Might some aspects, like the financials, but can it replace a human being listening person to person for a story? No. That I don't think will ever change. Sarah, don't ask a difficult question. Give me a softball.
I can't talk. So, okay, I'll make it simple. Torture is the word that I have in my mind right now.
Well, that describes philanthropy.
Because
Or Caldor Fire.
when a donor to Dorado Community Foundation wants to become a donor, and then you start a donor-advised fund, at some point, serious torture comes from how much of this, it comes from, if I make an endowment, I forever lose 96% of the power, you might say, for an expendable fund. Do
Yeah.
you see any kind of future where, to me, it's a torture. I mean,
Yeah.
a losing sleep torture. You know, like, and I talk to any human being who will talk to me about what they think,
Yeah.
as I have with you. Do you picture into the future them making a 90-10% endowment so that they can release more annually?
Well, within the structure, so what Sarah brought up is the difference between an endowment and expendable fund. So that's the question that she's asking, because if you're in an endowment, that money is like a savings account. It stays there and it grows, and you're allocated as a donor a certain percentage every year to spend. But the corpus, the main bulk of that money, stays invested. Expendable fund is like your checking account. Whatever's in there, it's liquid. You can spend it. So donors often question about, where's my balance? Should I be an endowment? Should I be an expendable? Should I be 50-50, 90-10? Where should I be? For me, the answer goes back to conversations I've had with people that said, well, you have in your endowment, you've got $25 million. Why not spend it all? Why are you keeping it? You could solve so many problems with spending $25 million out into the community. My answer was always, then what? Problem's gonna go away? You're gonna solve everything? Alcoholism isn't gonna go away. Drug addiction's not gonna go away. Homelessness is not gonna go away. You're not going to solve it by just dumping money at it. So it becomes a question for you as a donor, is what is you trying to achieve?
Do you see that 4%-ish ever changing much in the future?
It has changed in the past. So that's all depends upon, because your endowment's invested in the market. So the market's going to fluctuate up and down. So the percentage was 5%. And then foundations started getting nervous, saying, is that too much? Because of the downturn in the market in 2007 and how far it crashed, and endowments were sinking below their historical level. And so that became a big concern. So all the foundations moved to a 4% allocation out of an endowment, feeling like they felt safe that the market's going to return 6%, but giving 4, your corpus is going to grow by at least 2. So it's always, you're looking for that balance. As a donor, is what are you trying to achieve? There's short-term goals and long-term goals. So it's, yeah. And whatever comes out of your endowment can funnel into your expendable fund. And it just, is that enough? Yep.
Bill,
No,
Okay, all right.
no, haven't seen that. No, because they're still focused on their ROI. So the tree's still going to be 15 years old. It's still time to push that tree over because it's had its lifespan. If I worked for Benetton Corporation as well, and they're, so a lot of people associate with United Colors of Benetton, but Benetton, they're an Italian family out of Edizione, Italy. They own Rollerblade, Prince Racket, Echelon, Castle Skis, and again, they're very strategic in how they're addressing the market. So I don't see how they can move into an emergent field. No, because it's all about profit. So what is the profit margin going to be returned? And I think that constrains you in a corporate setting to be emergent. Will we see emergent corporations come out of AI? Probably. I think that's where we'll start to see emergent behavior in corporations. I can't think of one now that's exhibiting that.
Question to ask AI.
Yeah, not even, so yeah. Well, there'll be emergent behavior soon in corporations. There's some that have tried it. REI is because of the membership pattern that they have. So they're sort of dabbling in it, but still they have to come up with a return. They still have stockholders. They still have dividends that they're wanting to pay. So I think that doesn't allow for that flexibility that is needed in emergent behavior. So can a corporation take advantage of a trend? There's always a possibility. And we had pet rocks. So, that was emergent behavior. Why are we going out paying $12 for a dumb rock? It comes in a box. That worked.
Would it work in government?
I would hope not. So I have really strong feelings about government, is that government should govern. They should never be in the business of doing social services. I think they're horrible at it. I think the nonprofit sector is so much more adept because they can move quickly to whatever the need is. Government, especially funding that comes from the federal government through the state, comes with so many restrictions. I cannot tell you how many times I've been at a county meeting where we're talking about a social service and I can't understand a word because it's in a language that is so foreign and so convoluted that it's just so complicated. The government is really good at meeting those objectives that are laid out in this funding. They're not good in delivering the service. And I think that's how it should be broken down. It's like you report, let community provide. Let the nonprofit sector provide the service. Yeah, Carol.
I've been a long supporter of the foundation. I was on one of the early boards just before you got hired, actually, and have watched it grow. We were really small when I was on the board, and I think Main Street is a great place to have a business. We've had all of our business, except when I had my house to begin with, has been on Main Street. Now we're still up on Main Street. But my question is, we are one of a number of small businesses that we sit on boards, we participate as much as we can, but somehow this nonprofit profit thing gets in the way. And I don't know how we can get around it, but I think you guys are missing, well, the foundation is missing the boat, not utilizing businesses who are not nonprofits. They're not government agencies, they're small businesses. And there's a lot of us, by the way.
Yeah, that's a congressional.
And
legal.
You know, we've been here for 38 years. We started here.
Yeah,
So
so
look, we're brand new. We just started.
the charter that created, so Carol's asking the question about how can foundations support not only the nonprofit sector, but the profit sector, businesses that are local businesses. And the reason why we can is because we're constricted by federal regulations that say who we can fund and who we can't fund. And then there's consequences for the foundation in the kind of effort that we go into that could be considered profit called UBI, unrelated business income. So if we go into a profit sector and we receive income from that, we are taxed on it, which normally a nonprofit, when you're doing something and you're receiving an income, you're not taxed on it. But if it's for profit, government sees it as a UBI and you're taxed. So it's really federal regulation that prevents nonprofits from investing in a local for-profit business.
Or vice versa. Or a local business investing in a foundation.
That can happen. There's multiple people that have a business that have invested in the foundation, but not as particularly the business.
Right.
Yeah. So if Rayleigh's Auto wants to establish a fund at the foundation, I'd go, yeah, please. That would be great, but that does happen. I think the Rayleighs have a fund at Sacramento Regional Community Foundation. So you do see businesses create funds for their charitable work.
Right.
But the reason why we can't go back the other way is federal regulation.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a time when I first started at the foundation, Charlie, you and I, we were down in San Francisco at the Council of Foundations big convening that they did. It's a national meeting of community foundations. And that was just about the time that the Pension Protection Act had come out, and it was 2004, then it had been revised again. And the pension protection, I love Congress, how they pass rules and regulations, and then under a bill called the Pension Protection Act that has nothing to do with pension protection, but had a lot to do with community foundations and donor advised funds. So they passed restrictions on donor advised funds because they saw them as one of the dirty dozen. That there was things occurring within donor advised funds, like you create a donor advised fund and then you award your kids scholarships and off they go and it's all tax free. And IRS sort of frowned on that. Not a big surprise, but they put restrictions on donor advised funds and on scholarships of what you can and cannot do. And I would imagine we're going to see, I keep expecting it to happen any time now, but I know the Internal Revenue Service is not happy with Vanguard and Schwab having donor advised funds at the same place where the donor has their investment. They're not happy with that arrangement. So it could be that they're going to step in and make it that they have to divest of those funds, have to go someplace else. So it's changing. It goes back to that dynamic of Emergent. It's like, who knows what's going to happen? But
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. And 20 years ago, if you asked me if I'd have been standing here today, I retired as the director of the foundation, I'd be like, nope. It was the experience of a lifetime, and I am so honored that I got to be the steward for as long as I did. It was a lot of work, but I enjoyed every moment of it.
We so appreciate you.
Do I miss it? No, I don't. No. I was talking to Susie Davies, who's retired from war, and she said she's had a really hard time making that transition. Nope, not had that problem. So there's a couple things. To have 3 emails in the morning and all of them junk, it just, tickles my heart. So it's like swipe, 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 rather than 70, which is what I was getting. And no phone calls, and my voicemail's always full because I never answer it. And I'm like, what are they going to do, fire me? So it's nice. It's really nice. I enjoy it.
We appreciate everything you've done for our community.
Thank you. It was an honor, great honor. And I know it will continue to grow. The foundation's on a fast track now. Studies have shown you get to a certain point and then it really starts to grow. And the foundation's right at that point now where it'll really start to rocket off. Do we have some problems as a community? Yep. Housing is a big issue. Where we're going with that. As I was driving here on Missouri Flat Road, I looked to my left and I was like, are they building the 405 over there? A freeway? And it's what's going to happen in the next 15 years here. We see Folsom. It's like I lived in San Francisco. I now hyperventilate when I go to Folsom. It's like there's too many people I have to go home. It's crazy. And we have our little enclave here in El Dorado County, and I sure hope we can keep it for a while. Any other questions?
Well, I'll make a comment related to Steve Healy because it just shows a yin-yang of something you just said. When you talked about the people going to the board and shouting the homeless problem topic you brought up, and that people are going to the board and shouting at the board of supervisors, and that's bad, not helpful behavior. But when you said that, I triggered a memory I had of Steve Healy meeting with me, because I knew him from Human Services from New Morning, and we met and talked about solving the needs of people in El Dorado County, and he said the day he decided to try to start the El Dorado Community Foundation was the day that he went to the board of supervisors to try to get money for the nonprofit New Morning Youth and Family Services, and got shouted at by the board. We had an aggressive board some years past, and I smiled because it's sort of like that triggered, that bad behavior triggered Steve having a last straw to help start the foundation.
Yeah, the funny part of my follow-up to that, the phone calls that I get now are from board of supervisors. So it's really, I feel like they have me on speed dial, and it's like, no, he's not here, he's gone.
This is the answer.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, leave a message. Yeah, I do sit on one ad hoc committee for housing with the county, who told me it would last 6 months, and now we're a year and a half into it. So it's, be careful what you volunteer for. But they're making great progress, so I'm hopeful. Yeah. I think once you're involved in community, you never really walk away. You just don't. You stay engaged in smaller ways, and you stay out of the way. There's a conversation that's happening now about El Dorado Ready, which is going to be a ballot initiative maybe in the fall. And I saw somebody on the El Dorado Trail, and they said, would you be willing to be on a panel to speak about it? And I said, no, I won't. Because I don't want to be seen as representing the foundation. So I have to be very careful about that. Because people still identify me with that. And so it's like what I privately feel is my private part of my own feeling about something. I'm not going to get up on the stage and share it. So I'm careful about community topics and things and keep my opinion to myself, which is really nice and keeps me safe. Yeah. And I have been threatened at home if I join another board or committee. So kind of helps. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. That was fun.